used to have, when the White Tavern was active, it was a good place to go after services here. And they had a special preacher in who was a temperance preacher who so moved the entire congregation that they decided to all go over to the White Tavern and talk about it over drinks. The other one, which of course some of you have heard from me before, is that it was tradition in the military that if you're going to have military maneuvers for more than a few hours, you wanted to make sure that people had rum. And so their favorite drink was to mix rum with water, and we'll bring pails of it out when they're doing the maneuvers. So on April 19th, I'm pretty sure the patriots who came out so early, the militiamen, got quite cold and needed to get some rum. And then they moved across the other side of the bridge, and the British troops came in, and they went looking for the weapons, and they were getting cold and grumpy, so they needed to get some rum. So by the time it came time for the battle to break out, everybody was really quite inebriated. But that may have been the standard for the time. How many of you think you actually know Concord's history fairly well? And hopefully, Bob, you'll add yourself to that list. Okay. I'm hoping the more you think you know Concord's history, the more surprised you'll be this evening and the more you will go away with. Because we have told the story. I now have 8 different histories of Concord, most of which were out of print when the next one was written. But now, because of digitization, you can get them all online and get copies made. And it's amazing how the story changes as people look from different times. And it tells you more about the time they're looking from than the time they're talking about when they describe how it is. And one of my favorite ones, as I'll open with those ones, was the 1930s attempt to make sure that everybody knew that Concord bought our property fair and square, because the Indian removal that was going on in the Southwest was truly horrific. And a lot of Concord activists were working hard to try and have the Cherokee Trail of Tears not lead to the death and destruction that it was leading to. So it was important psychologically that Concord be able to say, we were better at dealing with the indigenous people. But as you'll see before we're done tonight, better is a relative term. Are we ready to go?
Is this the lecture, or
no.
Are you vamping and waiting?
I'm just vamping while I'm waiting for you.
I do apologize for the delay. We've sorted out our technical difficulties for our friends on Eventbrite. So I'm Victor Curran from the I guess I better speak into the mic, or the Eventbrite, or the online people can't hear me. I'm Victor Curran, and on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, I'm delighted to welcome you this evening. The Transcendentalism Council for over 15 years has been putting on programs like this that celebrate and educate about all the men and women who made Concord synonymous with American independence and imagination. And I'm really excited to have Jim Sherblom with us. There may be 1 or 2 people in the room who don't know Jim, and for your benefit, he is a member of the Transcendentalism Council. He's a retired UU minister, has a bachelor's degree in history from Yale, MBA from Harvard, Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry from Andover Newton Seminary. He has written a couple of books before, Spiritual Audacity and Spiritual Pilgrim. And tonight he's introducing his new book, which he's probably been telling you about while I was back on the computer, Concord Stories Volume 1, Musketaquid Indigenous Musketaquid to Colonial Concord. And this is what I love most about learning history, is learning these stories that have been ignored by past generations of historians, or are being suppressed by present generations of politicians. And Jim is telling us those stories. So thank you for your patience, and welcome Jim Sherblom.
So I counted. I have about 6 hours of stories in the book. So I'm not going to tell you 80% of them tonight. I've reduced it to about an hour's worth of stories. When we're done here, after about an hour, is this a problem? Okay. When we're done here after about an hour, we're going to go across the way, and they got refreshments there, drinks, and books for purchase for the Right Tavern. And I will sign any books that have been purchased from the Right Tavern if you'd like a signature tonight. If I go on too long and you need to leave early, you can still go get a drink and buy a book. Most of you know that until 2023, there was a prominent historical marker under a large tree across from the Right Tavern. It read, "Near this spot stood the ancient oak known as Jethro's tree, beneath which Major Simon Willard and his associates bought from the Indians the 6 miles of land square ordered by the General Court for the plantation of Concord, September 12, 1635. This is in many ways Concord's foundational myth. It's why we put it in the middle of town. Tourists come through and they look and they go, oh, this is what happened. It's not. Except that the English settlers didn't move to Concord until their church was established in Cambridge the following year. They didn't buy the land from the indigenous people. Their first recorded exchange with indigenous people wasn't until 1637, and it was a settlement over destruction of a native fish weir, and reputedly took place in Reverend Peter Bulkley's house a short distance up the Lowell Road, and not under an oak tree. This is the nature of foundational myths. We tell the stories we need to hear in order to feel good about who we are, and sometimes overlook the things that we would rather not know. But it led me, watching that and that's how far off it was, I go, who's this guy Jethro anyway? His Algonquin name was Tantamoose, and he was born around 1614 on Nipmuc land west of Musketaquid. He converted to Christianity in 1646 and served as the minister at the indigenous Christian plantation of Oconomowoc, what's now called Marlborough, for 28 years as a Christian indigenous minister. As times were getting more controversial, in 1674, Reverend John Eliot sent him as a missionary to the Nipmuc village of Wecumeshet, what is now Sterling, which was not yet Christian, to help Christianize that community. A year later, the Wecumeshet Tribal Council sided with Metacom, who's often referred to as King Philip, in a rebellion against English land theft. Now, Tantamoose was in a tough place. He supported the English. He was a missionary from the English on behalf of the Christian God, but this was his congregation. So he stayed with them. And he was captured. When he was captured, they stripped him of all his goods, severely whipped him, and sent him to Deer Island concentration camp for him to spend the rest of the war. When the war ended, Jethro was a broken man, living in poverty in the indigenous village of Natick. However, 6 years later, King James revoked the Mass Bay Charter, canceling all land grants from the colonial legislature except the ones where the land had also been purchased directly from the indigenous people or other owners. The leaders of Concord rounded up 4 old men, all in their early 70s, Richard Rice, William Buttrick, Manitucket, and Jethro, to swear under oath the land had been purchased in Reverend Buckley's house on September 12, 1635, which we know is not true. And Jethro didn't read English, but he did leave a mark saying, you read me what I'm saying and I give it under oath, this is true. So these are the way the stories come about. And this is why this repeated story becomes part of Concord's history. But I want to take you into what I have been able to discover by going and trying to find the records that weren't there 5 years ago. And digitizing records has opened up to us an enormous amount of material, particularly about the indigenous people that we didn't have access to before. Nenepeshet of Mystique, born around 1580, was a warrior and supreme sachem of the Massachusetts Confederation until he died in 1617 fighting French-aligned Abenaki warriors. His wife, Sansqua of Mystique, who kept her personal name away from the English settlers for whatever magical reasons she had in mind, But Sanskrit Mystique sought the protection of her younger brother, Tahatawan, of the Nishada clan of Musketaquid, with her second husband, Wibakawat, and his son, Wabin. Tahadawan's son, John Tahatawan, and his daughter, Tasun Tahatawan, and Wabin were teenagers growing up together on Musketaquid before the English settlers came. Imagine these teenagers who are bringing on this tradition that goes back now thousands of years, and they're hearing rumors about these ships full of white landless people traveling up and across their shores of Turtle Island, but they haven't met them yet. And they're in their 30s when the settlers first make their way to Concord. England had been torn apart for 100 years by religious wars. From 1533, Henry VIII had split from the Roman Catholicism, stealing the church's lands and suppressing Roman Catholic monasteries. 20 years later, his successor, Bloody Mary, a devout Roman Catholic, retaliated by killing Anglo-Protestant heretics, including Puritans. 5 years later, her sister Elizabeth, a devout Protestant, upon her ascent to the throne, proceeded to arrest and confiscate the estates of Roman Catholics, Anglo-Catholics, Baptists, Separatists, and Puritans, with religious intolerance justifying death and destruction. This is the culture that these English settlers came out of, that it was one that power would often accrue to itself property and would find religious justifications for doing so. Now, Wabin and Tasun were their generation's power couple. They're my favorite ones in the entire book. Following the 1617 smallpox epidemic that wiped out whole Massachusetts villages along the coast and the 1620 arrival of Pilgrim separatists, they moved to Nonantum, what is now Newton, to learn English and better understand these mysterious white landless people with contagious diseases. In 1625, they befriended William Blackstone, later changing his name to Blackstone, at Shawmut, which later became Boston, who in 1630 introduced them to newly arrived Governor John Winthrop, who was a slave owner, and later Roger Williams, who was not. On Wabin's conversion to Christianity, he took the Christian name Thomas, and Governor Winthrop appointed him the governor of all the Indian tribes from about where Dover, New Hampshire is, to Mount Hope in Rhode Island, and west to the Connecticut River. This included all of Thomas Wabin's kin from the remnants of the Massachusetts Confederation, west into Nipmuc country, and south as far as the Pocasset and Pokanoket tribes of Rhode Island. In 1632, Reverend John Eliot was a newly appointed minister at First Church in Roxbury, and roughly Wabin's age, even though they had very different backgrounds, and they started to become traveling companions and became fast friends. And much of what we know about Wabin comes from the writings of John Eliot. Thus, in the context of Concord's founding, 1635, and settlement in 1637 in the Nipmuc homeland, is this coming together of two cultures who couldn't possibly understand each other, and one generation keeps it separate. This next generation tries mightily to find connection, the people who were in their 20s and 30s when they came here. And then you have a follow-on generation, as you'll see, that had much less sympathy with the other side. Born in Odell, Bedfordshire on January 31st, 1583, Reverend Peter Bulkley was a 10th generation descendant of Baron Robert Bulkley, who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. At age 18, Peter earned a divinity degree from Cambridge University and married Jane Allen. He is coming out of a very high status place in society, is young, is brilliant, is a scholar, and he marries Jane, who is her cousin. Sir Thomas Allen was the mayor of London, and her nephew, Oliver St. John, was the Lord Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas. This is the highest parts of English society. And Jane gave birth to 12 children over the next 14 years, most of whom died from contagious diseases as children, and she died giving birth to their last child. This left Peter, and this is this common story of that time. The contagious diseases were much more in London than most other parts of the world. And they brought them, when you put them on these people on the ship who have contagious diseases, and incubate the disease for several months as you make your way to the New World and enter a world that has no immunity to your diseases, it's no surprise that 80 to 90% of the people along the shore who had contact with them died. 8 years later, Peter remarried to a noblewoman named Grace Chetwood, and when Peter was banned from preaching in England for being a Puritan, they secretly made their way to the Mass Bay colony, which was a Puritan enclave. Upon their arrival, Peter became the most well-regarded and richest of the Puritan ministers in Mass Bay. 30-year-old Major Simon Willard was Concord's most prominent military and commercial founder. Born in Hosmondon in the county of Kent, Simon was the youngest son of his father's second wife. He had married Mary Shoppy, a local farm girl, and was a captain in the Kentish militia with 2 young daughters when he and Mary decided to emigrate to the Mass Bay seeking commercial opportunities. Through Waban, it appears that Major Willard met Tehadawan and established a trading post near the foot of Neshatok Hill here at the confluence which formed the Musketaquid River. In 1641, the Mass Bay General Court granted to him a monopoly on trading in furs with the eastern Nipmuc people. Commercial monopolies and land grants helped him tremendously to prosper. He did so well that he then petitioned them and they gave him the sole exclusive rights to sell alcohol for a while as well to the indigenous people here. Countless English settlers might well have perished except for the help of these local indigenous people. The English seeds and animals that they had brought across the ocean did not thrive in this environment. Their new neighbors introduced them to corn, squash, and beans grown in mounds and small fish as fertilizer, which has always done well on this land. They taught them how to use medicinal herbs and how to capture wild meat to eat. Simon Willard and his wife, that generation, his wife Mary, soon adapted, but many of the older settlers resisted living like natives. They looked down upon that way of being. They would rather starve than live like a native. In the winter of 1637, Reverend Peter Buckley played an important role resolving an antinomian crisis by voting to banish Roger Williams. The antinomian issue which keeps coming up in Christianity is, are you saved because God's good? Are you saved because you're good? Unitarian Universalists resolve that problem by saying, we're too good to have to worry about being saved, and God's too good to damn us anyway. But this is a crisis that comes up every so often, every generation in Christianity, saying, where do you give the credit? So in this case, Peter Buckley voted to send Roger Williams, Ann Hutchinson, and their followers away from Mass Bay down to what became Rhode Island, because they were upholding that it was really God's grace, not man's. Reverend Buckley went so far as to publish a book popular among Puritans in both New and Old England, laying out the theological questions involved, where he basically concludes it's a free gift from God, but you have to sacrifice yourself to accept it. He felt he had it both ways, and it was a very popular book. About this time, Buckley's oldest son, Edward, returned to Odell to marry a widow named Lucian and adopt her daughter, Lucy. Oddly enough, this makes no mention of this in the First Parish records. Either his trip back there or his new wife. His father appears to have not approved of the marriage, and father and son were estranged until Edward returned to take up the Marshfield pulpit in the Plymouth plantation, leaving his 2 eldest children, the boy, Peter, who's named after his grandfather, to be raised by his doting father and stepmother. Family dynamics, as I discovered as I started tracing it across generations, are really strange. And normally they don't put them down. Thomas Dane was a carpenter, and he had indentured himself to Peter Buckley in 1635, where he came across to build them houses, barns, a grist mill, a tannery for the Buckley clan. He was the primary builder in the early days of Concord here, at least for the more elite. And he married another servant, Elizabeth Woodhouse, in 1638. Having built a number of houses over 7 years, his indenture was coming to an end, and Buckley said, tell you what, if you work for me another 7 years, I'll give you the money and a land grant to build a house. So he did work another 7 years, and with the money and land grant, right across from First Parish, built to one of the houses on the other side of the road here. And his daughter grew up to marry the First Parish sexton. William Buttrick came to Concord as a landless peasant, but after serving many years as the town sergeant-at-arms, then deputy sheriff of Middlesex County, he was able to buy his own land and was quite a successful farmer. His oldest son, Samuel Buttrick, ended up marrying Elizabeth Blood, Simon Willard's widowed granddaughter, and this brought him into the circle of the elite. With the importance of accumulating wealth and power over generations, their great-grandson, Major John Buttrick, would lead the Concord Minutemen in 1775. These family ties proved very important. Humphrey Barrett settled in Concord in 1639. His son, Humphrey Jr., though born in England, grew up in Concord from the age of 9. Humphrey Jr. was a church deacon, Concord's representative in the general court, and an ensign in the Concord militia. His sons from his second marriage, Joseph and Benjamin, fell in love with and married two sisters, Rebecca and Lydia Minote, establishing another one of Concord's tight-knit, prominent families across multiple generations. It gets at one point in Concord's history where in the elementary school in the east part of town, almost half the students are related to each other. The first indigenous people enslaved in Mass Bay were captives from the Pequot Massacre in 1636. The colonial militias distributed captured Pequots as slaves among their officers and indigenous allies. Puritan leaders, including Governor Winthrop, enslaved women and children while selling the warriors into the southern slave plantations. In 1636, the ship Desire left Marblehead, Mass. With 17 enslaved Pequot prisoners of war, returning in 1638 from Bermuda with cotton, tobacco, and enslaved Africans. So by 1641, Massachusetts had more enslaved Africans than Virginia. And Governor Winthrop codified the first British Empire first laws on enslavement. In 1647, Samuel Vassall, Mass Bay's largest slave trader, named his largest slave ship the Mayflower to honor his pilgrim heritage. It sailed from Boston to London to the coast of West Africa, where it purchased 352 enslaved Africans, which it took to Barbados to be sold into the emerging sugar plantations. Concord's financial elite investing in such voyages could double their investment in less than a year. The triangle trade was very profitable. It was very risky. It required enormous amounts of suffering. The suicide rates of the sailors was extraordinarily high, as well as the captives who would often throw themselves overboard rather than go into the life of slavery. So there was high losses associated with it, but the profits could be 100, 200% a year. In the following decades, Jamaica would emerge as England's richest and most exploitive colony, generating more wealth for Britain than all of its American colonies together. As different as Mass Bay and the Puritans and Jamaica were in many ways, their financial elites became deeply intertwined. Providing the money to build these slave ships, fund their multi-year voyages, purchase their enslaved Africans, and exchange them in Port Royal, Jamaica, for sugar was profitable for Jamaica as well as English and colonial financiers. All plantations specialized in high-value crops, so Concord also helped to feed them. By 1645, Reverend John Eliot and Wabin had been traveling together for over a decade, were fluent in each other's language, were really close friends, and had developed a written version of the Algonquin language that could be translated back into English. In 1646, Reverend Eliot preached his first sermon in Algonquin at Nonantum, based on Ezekiel chapter 37:9, which basically says, the Spirit, God's breath, will save you. It will bring these dead people back to life. It was one of Gary Smith's favorite passages. In Algonquin, Wabin's name means Holy Spirit or wind. So the indigenous people heard that Wabin brought life. They stayed up most of the night talking about what this sermon meant. Thomas Wabin seems to have reconciled himself to this role as the Christian God's intermediary to the indigenous people. As he later wrote, if we did not pray to their God, the English might kill us. As the mighty sachem of the Wampanoags, Massasoit was approaching 60 years old when he was worried about the colonists' relentless lust for indigenous land. He had two teenage sons, Wamsutta, who the colonists called Alexander, and Metacom, who they called Philip. And his good friend Combatant was sachem of the Pocasset tribe and had two teenage daughters, Weetamoo and Wudamakunuske. He proposed Wamsutta next in line to lead the Wampanoags, marry Weetamoo next in line to lead the Pocassets, and to solidify their alliance, Metacom would also marry Wudamakunuske to create an indigenous network of alliances through interconnected families. But more land speculators continued to arrive every year. John Prescott had an investment group that illegally acquired titles to the lands of the Nashaway Nation just west of here, connecting it with Concord with a bridge across the Sudbury River. For his help in arranging the transaction, Major Willard was granted a large tract of land in what became Lancaster. John White, another large investor in Lancaster and its first slave owner, married his 20-year-old daughter, Mary, to Lancaster's Harvard-trained minister, Reverend Joseph Rowlandson. And Mary Rowlandson will become famous later for her slave narrative of being captured narrative by the indigenous people. By 1850, the indigenous frontier was moving west, taking much of the profits from land speculation along with it. And so some of the descendants of Concord, including two of Reverend Buckley's sons, have decided to move for better opportunities in central Mass and in Connecticut. They were increasingly replaced by financial elites, not necessarily Puritans, seeking to live in Concord in a style they could not do in England. One example is the brothers Hoare, Leonard and John. Leonard became Mass Bay's leading theologian and president of Harvard College, and his younger brother John became one of the Massachusetts Bay's most prominent lawyers, that he used to debate cases with Daniel Webster, and people would come from miles around to listen to these two go after each other. Harvard and Concord had a shared history, both founded in 1636, with generations of Buckley, Willard, Barrett, Prescott, and Hoare sons educated at Harvard. You'll get a little repetitive. I'll tell you each of the stories when I tell them, and they're almost all Harvard graduates. In 1645, Harvard added an English missionary-funded Indian college to educate and anglicize the most promising indigenous young people. In 1659, Wowaus, a Nipmunk indigenous person from the indigenous Christian village of Hennemasset in what was then Western Massachusetts, enrolled at Harvard to be trained as a printer and translator. To the colonists, he became known as James the Nipmunk Printer, with strong family ties throughout the Nipmunk homelands, and he will play a key factor in Prince Philip's War. The Massachusetts General Court granted thousands of acres of formerly indigenous land to Concord's most favored citizens, as well as granting it to themselves, to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, members of the colonial legislature. Major Daniel Gookin, leader of the provincial legislature and an enslaver, received several of such grants of indigenous lands between 1660 and 1672, while he served as the superintendent of the Praying Indians reservations, and he was their primary legislative advocate. These kinds of conflicts, where even the ones who were being supportive of the indigenous people were rampant. Reverend John Eliot and Major Daniel Gookin persuaded Wabun and Sassoon to abandon their prime location near Boston, surrounded by land-hungry colonists, in exchange for a hilly bit of wilderness 18 miles west, which became the indigenous Christian village of Natick. Displaced indigenous clans from around Mass Bay, including some from Concord area, flocked to this reservation governed by Christian indigenous people. Then Reverend Eliot and Major Simon Willard persuaded Tehadawon to exchange what land the Nipmunks retained in Concord, mostly around Neshotic Hill, surrounded by land-hungry colonists, for a Neshoba reservation, which is now in Littleton, of Christian indigenous people, many of whom served as scouts in support of the Concord militia, with their lives entirely dependent upon their exchange with the English. In 1657, Tehadawon died, leaving his son John Tehadawon as sachem of Neshoba, and with many Christian grandchildren. At that point of the story, where we were in about 25 years, it looks like they've chosen well by allying themselves with the English, as opposed to the ones who decided not to. The next year, Concord's leading theologian and landowner, Reverend Peter Buckley, died, leaving large bequests for his second wife, all his surviving children, funds to create a library for Concord's children, and to grow Concord's library. He was a generous, theologically strict, Catholic-hating, aristocratic, white supremacist, and he was probably the best possible example of both the worst and best of that culture. He was an exemplar and a man I can only have enormous respect for, and yet, judged by our standards today, it's really hard to not see some of the things he did as being reprehensible. In 1660, at age 45, Edward Buckley succeeded his father in the Concord pulpit, where he would serve for another 34 years. With no Harvard degree, he was a self-taught, pious country pastor. Concord's Harvard-educated elite, including John Hoare, the lawyer, and Philip Reed, the doctor, and even, unfortunately, Edward's own son, Peter, disparaged his preaching and made fun of him. Hoare and Reed persuaded the congregation to call a Harvard-educated minister, Joseph Estabrook, as their assistant minister. But it didn't stop there. In 1668, Hoare was fined 10 pounds for declaring at a local tavern that the blessings Reverend Buckley pronounced in dismissing the congregation was vain babbling. Somebody he was drinking with had to go and report this. Dr. Reed suggested that Edward's preaching made one of his patients physically ill, for which Reed was fined 20 pounds. And our educated Concord elite emerged in this generation in rural Concord, and you go through Concord's history, it's that elite that's playing off against other people, farmers, ordinary workers, about who is Concord for. In 1660, Combatant died, leaving his daughter Weetamoo Sensquat of Pocasset, and the following year, Massasoit died, leaving Wamsutta sachem of the Wampanoags. However, Wamsutta had to go to Plymouth to validate his claim, and he died there under mysterious circumstances, which many people thought was poisoning. In order to deal with, he was seen as too strong a candidate, and they hoped to deal with his younger brother, Metacom. Well, that turned out to be a mistake. Metacom and Weetamoo decided on the basis of that there was now no other path open. They would not negotiate, they were going to go to war. Between 1640 and 1670, the population of people of English descent in southern New England nearly tripled from 18,000 to 54,000, while the indigenous population continued to decline. In 1670, when Willard's lead scout, Christian Nipmuc sachem John Tehadawan, died in battle with Western Nipmuc tribes, he was replaced by Harvard-educated Thomas Wabun II, who was awarded the rank of captain in the Middlesex militia. Edmund Andros, the governor of New York, allied then with the Mohawks, who were sworn enemies of the Nipmunks. And in subsequent colonist wars, each side always had their own indigenous allies. By the late 17th century, Concord was an increasingly important colonial outpost for protecting the British Empire from New France and their indigenous allies. By 1675, the number of English colonists had grown to 120,000, while the remaining indigenous had shrunk to a few tens of thousands. The indigenous frontier was being pushed further south into former Pequot lands, west into the remainder of the Nipmuc lands, and increasingly north into Abenaki lands. The Concord militia were fighting further and further abroad and increasingly compensated with indigenous lands since there was no hard currency. John Sassaman was born in the Pennacook village of Wamiset, which is now where Lowell is, but his parents died of smallpox, so he was brought up as an indentured servant of Richard Callicott of Dorchester. He evidently was quite a smart young man. He quickly learned how to English. He was Christianized. He was enrolled in Harvard's Indian College as a teenager. He became an English teacher, a translator, and negotiator for his indigenous brethren. He also learned how to negotiate for himself. In January 1675, he cheated Metacom out of some prime land around a pond called Assawampet. Shortly thereafter, his dead body was found beneath the ice of Assawampet. The Pilgrims used this murder as the basis to attack Metacom's lands. For Metacom and Weetamoo, this was the final atrocity that led to what the English called King Philip's War. Abenaki scholar Lisa Brooks describes King Philip's War this way: as a multi-tribal indigenous resistance movement during colonial expansion to reclaim land and rebalance relations in the shared Algonquin homeland. The English colonists instead saw it as the wrath of God raining down upon them. As Metacom and Weetamoo were forced by colonial militia west and north, they gathered followers in the Nipmuc homelands of central Massachusetts, including among dispossessed Nipmunks who no longer trusted Daniel Gookin, John Eliot, or Simon Willard. Major Willard was forced to lead the Middlesex militia deeper into Nipmuc territory to defend Groton, Lancaster, and Hadley. His partner in the fur trade, Captain Wheeler, led the Concord militia in fights closer to Concord. In July 1675, the Concord militia was ambushed by indigenous warriors 10 miles beyond Brookfield. Captain Wheeler fell in the first attack. His lieutenant, Simon Davis, who was Major Willard's nephew, took command and led the retreat to Brookfield, where they discovered that the town was already under siege. The warriors rained flaming arrows down on the garrison's wooden walls, but the colonial soldiers quickly doused the flames. Next, the indigenous warriors filled wagons with hay, flax, and candlewood, set them on fire, and rolled them towards the wooden walls. But then a sudden rainstorm saved the trapped colonials. As they were increasingly in despair, the colonists heard a bugle call signaling the arrival of Major Willard and his reinforcements. The indigenous warriors withdrew, but Brookfield was ruined and many were dead. The town of Lancaster had 50 families, including John Prescott and 2 of his sons and their families. The elder of the 2 sons, Jonathan, had married John Hoare's daughter Elizabeth in Concord in June 1675. Just weeks later, Metacom and Weetamoo attacked the town without success. So they turned west and hoped to find another path, killed 8 colonists in 5 towns along the Connecticut River Valley. Major Willard had fortified the eastern colonial towns so the Metacom and Weetamoo could not win unless they could access a much larger group of warriors, and there only was one that was available to them. The only possibility appeared to be allying with the Mohawks, their sworn enemies, but famous for the ferocity in battle. Metacom and Weetamoo found this an impossible choice. What they didn't know is that the governor of New York had already struck a deal with the Mohawks. So the Mohawks attacked them all and started killing them from the west side while the colonists were attacking them from the east. All was lost. By August, the colonial legislature voted to arrest all the friendly Christian indigenous people living on reservations and transport them to a concentration camp on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. The native Christians were the first to be arrested and deported. In November, Reverend Eliot and Major Willard petitioned the colonial legislature to allow John Hoare to house and employ the 58 remaining Neshoba Christian indigenous people on his property in Concord, what is now the Orchard House. This agreement lasted for a matter of months. Under another attack on Lancaster, whereafter the Concord Indians were arrested and sent to Deer Island to die of starvation or be sold into slavery. Concord's history of treating its indigenous people well ended at this point. Early the morning of February 10th, 1676, 15 indigenous warriors attacked Lancaster. Nearly a quarter of the town's residents were either killed or captured, including the minister's wife, Mary Rowlandson, and her 3 children. The Middlesex militia raised 80 soldiers, 15 of them from Concord itself, including Daniel Goebel and his nephew, Stephen Goebel. But they arrived in Lancaster only in time to bury the mutilated bodies of men, women, and children, many of whom were their relatives. That spring, rumors flew of planned attacks on Marlborough, Concord, Sudbury, Watertown, Cambridge, and even Boston. In April, hostile indigenous warriors attacked Sudbury, turning at least one of the rumors into fact. A small group of Concord militia that rushed to Sudbury's aid were ambushed and 100% killed. These men were often from prominent Concord families, which made the growing fear and hatred in Concord. As the war raged on, Major Simon Willard now in his 70s, and the last living tie to the Concord's original founding, was dying. He had been married 3 times, to Mary Shoppy and then Elizabeth Dunster and then her sister Mary Dunster. He had 17 children, 14 of whom lived to adulthood, married and had children of their own. When his estate was liquidated, it was enough to give each of his 12 remaining surviving children their own farm or estate. And his estate would have been much larger. He hadn't lost most of it in King Philip's War. If you compare what happened to him to what happened to any of the indigenous people, he leaves thousands of descendants with millions of dollars of wealth, and the indigenous people have a much smaller descendants and much less wealth. In May, Metacom and Weetamoo sent Thomas Doublet, a Concord Nipmunk, with a message to Reverend Rawlinson saying that his wife Mary and children could be ransomed. Reverend Rawlinson asked John Hoare to represent them in the negotiations, so he and Thomas Doublet traveled to Wachusett Mountain to negotiate her ransom. This was not only a chance to ransom Mary, but perhaps a chance to negotiate an end to this war. He negotiated Mary's release for 20 pounds, and her 2 surviving children refused to be ransomed. They preferred staying with the indigenous. So John Hoare returned with Mary and some peace terms that he hoped would bring a peaceful resolution. On May 11th, 1676, Massachusetts military leaders met Weetamoo and Metacom midway between Concord and Groton to discuss those terms. James Prentice served as translator. The language of the General Court's response, drafted by the General Court Secretary Edward Rawlinson, shows a certain bias in terms of the pidgin English that he uses to address these Harvard-educated savages. He writes, "To the Indian sachems, we sent our messengers according to your desire, and we very true of heart, but you no give us an answer in writing. Now we send our men, Peter Gardner and Jonathan Prescott of Concord, to know your mind, whether you willingly let us have our women and children you have captive, and if you have any proposal to make to us, we willing to hear you. And if you come yourselves, we send some of our sachems to treat with you at Concord." Indigenous warriors who turned themselves in good faith based on this assurance were arrested and sold into slavery. The indigenous resistance collapsed. Metacom's and Weetamoo's camps were short of warriors and full of fevers and disease. In August, John Alderman, a native Christian allied with the English, came upon a very sickly Metacom and shot him dead. He then cut off his head as a prize for which the Plymouth colonists mounted on a pole as a warning to others at the entrance to Plymouth. Metacom's wife, Winnekamuskit, and her son, Medam, were captured and sold into Bermuda slavery. Weetamoo was drowned crossing a river, perhaps suicide. This ended nearly 2 generations of colonial and indigenous hostilities near Concord. In King Philip's War, indigenous losses exceeded 3,000 men, women, and children, or about 27% of their population, while the English lost only 600, about 1% of the population. Massachusetts paid for the war by selling over 350 indigenous people into slavery, mostly women and girls, and confiscating for sale indigenous homelands. In this way, John Winthrop's New Jerusalem, the city on a hill as an example to the nations, became a vivid example of the horrors of Christian colonization imposed by force on the nations of the world. And we've seen that story now so many times in so many settings. But in order to save you a little bit, I'm going to skip ahead. At 11:43 a.m. on June 7th, 1682, Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake, and a resulting tsunami swept most of the city into the sea. Concord's Puritan founders would have seen this as a reward for Port Royal's wickedness. Their descendants, however, saw it as a once-in-a-lifetime commercial opportunity. By the end of the 17th century, Port Royal was rebuilt, and Port Royal, Jamaica, was England's wealthiest colony in the world. It had a population of 6,500 Englishmen and hundreds of houses, shops, and warehouses defended by English forts. The annual death rate in Jamaica was 10 times what it is in Concord at that period. mostly due to disease, but also violence and cruelty. But a well-financed young man could make a fortune. I'm going to give you a few examples. Reverend Samuel Willard's son, John, graduated from Harvard in 1690 and entered the triangle trade. By 1703, shortly after his father became president of Harvard, John relocated to slave trading in Jamaica. His grandson, Reverend Joseph Willard, would serve as another president of Harvard. William Willard, a son of Samuel by his second wife, Eunice, followed his half-brother John to Jamaica in 1706. 3 years later, he retired to London a wealthy man, and 3 years after that, he died at the age of 31, unmarried. He left his mother in his will 400 pounds sterling and several thousand pounds more to his cousins in Concord. This then was what it meant to be the life of an adventurer, and he was much respected and admired for being able to go out and make his way in the world. Simon Willard, a younger son of Samuel Willard, entered the triangle trade upon his Harvard graduation in 1685. He married Elizabeth Wally, daughter of Captain John Alden and great-granddaughter of John Alden of Plymouth fame. This Simon Willard developed international commercial connections largely built around the slave trade and built one of New England's enduring fortunes. When I look at this, I'm partially descended from John Alden. I'm pretty sure lots of my family has got ties somewhere with these different New England traders. Edward Willard, another grandson of Major Simon Willard, was trading slaves in Port Royal when he married Mary Poole in 1726. But many men also preferred to make their fortunes at sea. Captain Peter Buckley, grandson of Reverend Peter Buckley, was one of them. He grew up with dreams of wealth and adventure. He was a teenager when he first went to sea, but thanks to his family's wealth and connections, he took command of his first sailing vessel at the age of 23. He was described as a hearty fellow, well met, though he spent so much time at sea that he was unable to establish a family ashore. By his late 20s, Captain Peter was heavily involved in the slave trade. He died at sea at 37, leaving a sizable fortune to his siblings and cousins in Concord. His great-nephew, Captain Charles Buckley, later became a sea captain and also involved in the slave trade. Buckley descendants living in Concord sold produce from their commercial farms to feed the Southern Plain slave plantations. In 1713, Gershom Buckley, youngest son of Reverend Peter Buckley, died at age 77, leaving his maid Hannah to his daughter Dorothy. Reverend John Buckley, Gershom's son, grew up in a slaveholding household and graduated from Harvard in 1699 to become another noted Buckley scholar with several books to his name. Upon his death in 1733, he left his wife, the slave Caesar. Concord's population nearly doubled, first from 480 to 920 people between 1679 and 1706. It was a time of great and growing prosperity, and a lot of that had to do with the money being sent from those who adventured abroad. Over the next 20 years, the town grew another 63% to a population high of 1,500 residents. As Concord grew wealthier and more self-sufficient as the county seat of a prosperous Middlesex County, Concord citizens came to value their liberty and felt less connected or dependent on their English homeland. But thanks to ongoing French and Indian wars, Concord retained a strong military culture with boys from age 16 militarily trained and with military skills honed fighting the French and indigenous allies. Concord militia fought in King William's War in 1689 to 1699, Queen Anne's War, 1704 to 1713, Governor Dummer's War, 1722 to 1724, King George's War, 1744 to 1748, and various French and Indian fights that didn't even count as wars from 1754 to 1760. In 1725, the Concord militia was sent to exterminate France's indigenous allies in southern Maine around the Saco River. The Boston legislature paid 100 pounds sterling for every indigenous scalp, man, woman, or child. But there were no bounties for French scalps because that would have been considered barbaric. In 1735, Colonel John Flint led Concord militia to help conquer and displace French settlers from the Acadia region in Maine. In 1745, Captain David Melvin commanded a company from Concord that attempted to capture the French fort at Louisbourg. Captain Melvin died from battle wounds, as did Benjamin Prescott from the Prescott family. David's brother, Eliza, was promoted to captain, and 6 more Concord men died under his command. In 1745, Abijah Willard, Major Simon Willard's great-grandson, at the age of 21, led a company at the Battle of Louisbourg, and in 1756 commanded a company at the battle, commanded a company under Colonel Monckton in battles to capture the French forts of Nova Scotia. In 1755, John Hoare, grandson of Concord's colonist era lawyer, was captured in battle by Indigenous warriors. The odd thing is, when he told them who he was and about his grandfather had done for the Indigenous people, after 3 months they just let him go. Reputations can carry. These French and Indian wars had left the English government more than 145 million sterling in debt, and over $1 million of that had been spent on buying munitions for the colonies. To pay its debts, Parliament imposed crushing taxes on its English citizens, provoking massive anti-tax riots in England and sweeping 40,000 Englishmen into debtor's prison because they couldn't pay their bills. Parliament now resolved to impose new taxes on the English colonies to help share some of this massive tax burden. The colonies, however, increasingly felt independent of these debts and cherished their liberties and well-established over the previous 150 years. Lieutenant Daniel Hoare, grandson of the lawyer John Hoare, married Sarah Jones, granddaughter of Concord's founder, Reverend John Jones, raised 7 children in East Concord, though Daniel spent nearly half his adult lifetime fighting northern indigenous tribes in Maine. His tombstone in Concord's old burying ground reads, Lieutenant Daniel Hoare died February 8, 1773, age 93, by honest industry and prudent economy. He acquired a handsome fortune for a man in private character. He enjoyed a long life in uninterrupted state of health, blessings that attend exercise and temperance. Here's the end of his story. He's dead. Concord immigrants came in waves. First religiously persecuted Puritans, then land-hungry Anglican farmers, followed by Scottish Presbyterians, then French Huguenots, but initially all Protestants. Concord's commercial and trading culture reflected these changes. Robert Cumming, a Scotchman, arrived in 1715, setting up the shop on the church green, where, as he liked to point out, Mammon soon met meeting house. John Beaton opened a store across the mill dam and was soon elected town treasurer, though being a Presbyterian could not join the church. But the old talented family still tended to run the town. Jonathan Prescott and Elizabeth Hoare had one son that they named Jonathan before Elizabeth died in 1687. In 1689, Jonathan, the widower, married Rebecca Buckley, the widow of Peter Buckley, grandson of Reverend Peter Buckley, and adopted her 4 children, including the youngest one, 8-year-old Rebecca Buckley. Rebecca grew up to be a charmer, a local beauty, by far the most popular girl in town, with many suitors, but she fell in love with the town's dashing young doctor, Dr. Jonathan Prescott, her 4-year older stepbrother, and these estates keep intermarrying the elites. They married in 1701 and appears to have been a happy marriage. They were married for 28 years. Jonathan had a thriving medical practice, while Rebecca threw what were reported to be splendid parties and raised their 11 children. They were Concord's most elite family. However, Jonathan took ill and died relatively young. His tombstone reads, he was a gentleman of virtue and merit, an accomplished and successful physician, excelling in surgery, possessing much sagacity and penetration of mind. His life was highly valued and the death greatly lamented. He died October 28, 1729, age 52. Rebecca was only 48 with 5 children still at home. Charles, 18, Elizabeth, 16, Dorothy, 13, Abel, 11, and little Benjamin, 5. So she needed to marry again, which she managed to do when the town's popular minister, John Whiting, became widowed himself. In the early
19th century, Concord's Puritan founders discouraged strong alcohol. Dancing was prohibited, even at wedding receptions, for ideas that it could lead to fornication. In 1664, Concord enacted a severe penalty for rude singing of songs while intoxicated, for fear it could lead to lewd behavior. And with the influx of other kinds of Protestants, Concord culture adapted. Alcohol consumption greatly increased, especially beer and cider, soon followed by rum and whiskey, with most men now drinking most every day. Reverend John Whiting was called to Concord in 1711 to fill the vacancy caused by Reverend Joseph Estabrook's death. Like previous Concord ministers, Reverend Whiting was part of the Massachusetts elite. He graduated Harvard in 1700, married Mary Cotton, granddaughter of Reverend John Cotton, in 1701, and served on the Harvard Corporation. As a well-educated, attractive, married man with private fortune, he seemed suited to Concord's pulpit and was for 2 decades. From his Harvard training, Reverend Whiting brought innovations to worship. He translated Bible passages directly from Greek or Latin, which hadn't been done since Reverend Buckley's time. In 1714, Reverend Whiting acquired an organ for use in worship. The organ had been gifted to the Battle Street Church in Boston, but that congregational church had decided that it was too Anglican. Even King's Chapel, which was Anglican, rejected it as being too innovative. Reverend Whiting happily claimed the organ for Concord to improve congregational singing and worship. Many people welcomed Reverend Whiting's innovations, but others were repelled by them. However, given his high socioeconomic status, his innovations were tolerated. Reverend Whiting and his wife Mary had 6 children over 20 years. When Mary died in 1731 at the age of 42, Whiting lost the love of his life and mother of his teenage children. He was thrown into deep despair, yet attempted to carry on. He began drinking heavily, often appearing drunk at town gatherings, sometimes even in the pulpit. He married the widow Reverend Buckley Prescott, but his drinking continued. For years he promised to reform and would stop drinking, but then relapse. The selectmen tried to be sympathetic, but this was a public disgrace. So selectmen called to council of 7 ministers from surrounding churches to give their advice. The council was unanimous, and this was led by Reverend John Hancock from Lexington. He wrote, "We advise and direct the Church of Christ in Concord to remove the Reverend John Whiting from his pastoral office because of lapses of a more aggravated nature after public promise to reform." The Concord congregation was scandalized. Rebecca's parties remained popular, as was Whiting's sage advice when he was sober, but perhaps this lapse opened the way for the congregation to re-examine its purpose, and we see another turn in the path. At the end of the 17th century, the new royal charter granted by William and Mary had brought new religious liberty to Puritan Massachusetts. They sparked a religious revival. Harvard had always been led by Puritan divines. Now the faculty and corporation wanted a more religiously liberal president. In 1701, they had chosen Major Simon Willard's son, Reverend Samuel Willard, which was a bold choice. Then, 6 years later, they chose John Leverett, as their president, which was an even bolder choice. In response, Yale was founded as an orthodox response to Harvard's liberalization. In 1734, the American Great Awakening was sparked by Yale graduate Jonathan Edwards, a slaveholder, to bring greater emotional piety to congregational worship. Daniel Bliss was a slave-owning Yale student when he underwent a conversion experience under Edwards' preaching. So he was 24 years old when called to Concord's pulpit, bringing a fiery earnestness to his preaching. Whiting and Bliss could not be more different. In both preaching style and thinking, they attracted very different kinds of Christian worship. As a preacher, Reverend Bliss had striking qualities. As a revivalist, his soul was on fire, sometimes moved to tears of solemn denunciation of Harvard's liberalism. His voice grew louder and louder, his gestures more and more extravagant, his calls to repentance more fearful and commanding. Reverend Bliss completely abstained from drinking alcohol, in stark contrast to Whiting's ongoing alcoholism. Twice he invited famous English evangelists to preach from Concord's pulpit, creating a scandal with the Harvard-trained ministers in the surrounding pulpits. Bliss brought even more disorder to the congregation by baptizing John Jack, an enslaved man, to become Concord's first black member. And John Jack is the only person of African descent who's buried in the old burying ground. But if you go and visit it, they put it on the back side facing away from the church. So First Parish membership soared often while the congregation was torn apart. Fully a third of the congregation, including many of the cultured elite, found Reverend Bliss's preaching offensive and impossible to tolerate. They included most of the congregation's Harvard-educated, wealthier members. They begged to be relieved of paying taxes to support this evangelical minister, but with no other worship space available to them, they began to meet at the Black Horse Tavern. Why you would have an alcoholic minister lead worship at a Black Horse Tavern isn't clear to me, but it's right where it was located where the library now is. Let me skip ahead a little bit. Parliament first started conceiving taxes that it could impose, the so-called coercive taxes, in 1764 with the Sugar Act, which heavily taxed Jamaican sugar, and to avoid American vessels from circumventing the tax, required sugar to be carried in certified English vessels. Most of the sugar consumed by England and its colonies came from Jamaica and was a key component of this triangle trade. If strictly enforced, American smugglers would be put out of business. Sugar boycotts and smuggling soon ended this tax, though not before triggering one of England's worst recessions in their history, which nearly wiped out both English and American merchants and traders. The following year, Parliament replaced it with a stamp tax, a kind of sales tax, but this too was deemed hostile to American shipping and smuggling. Parliament replaced it with the Revenue Act of 1767, applied duties on English imported goods, but left the smugglers alone. But even that was caused massive rioting in Boston and attacks on English imports. So Parliament rescinded it except for a special tax on tea. This failure to be able to impose and enforce new taxes raised serious questions about the efficacy of parliamentary taxation. In 1766, Americans came in basically three categories, though many families were split between them: the aristocrats, the Whigs, and the radicals. The aristocrats often had government appointments and broadly supported Parliament. The Whigs, whether they were in London or in Boston, often sought to limit Parliament's governing role, especially around imposing new taxes without consulting the populace. The radicals increasingly wanted to throw off the constraints of the homeland. In England, only about 15% of white freemen could vote in parliamentary elections, compared to upwards of 50% now of white freemen in Mass Bay. The Whigs in Parliament hoped to follow the democratizing lead of the American colonies for themselves. Sunday, January 1st, 1766, was a bleak New England winter day. In the unheated meeting house, no heat, no water, no electricity. The congregation met for hours and decided to bring in Reverend William Emerson, great-great-grandson of Reverend Peter Buckley, as their new minister. At age 23, this inexperienced, young, ardent, highly enthusiastic idealist lived with the widow of the previous minister, Phoebe Bliss, the widow of Reverend Daniel Bliss, where he immediately fell in love with her daughter, who also was named Phoebe, and 6 months later they married. He built the manse for her as a wedding present, and over the next 10 years they had 5 children. Reverend Emerson openly preached American liberty and sedition from his pulpit. They didn't publish any of his sermons because it could have been basis on which he could be hung. In October 1768, 4 more remnants of the British Army arrived in Boston. Parliament's standing army now outnumbered adult males in Boston. All these troops had to be fed, and Concord's farmers could no longer reliably ship their produce to the southern plantations. So enterprising farmers like Captain James Barrett agreed to feed the troops, charging exorbitant prices. These costs were not sustainable for the General Court, and Parliament refused further funds. In many ways, feeding the standing army in Boston was helping to pre-fund the revolution, while their hated presence was being stirred up further by cutting them off of resources. By 1789, Parliament had had enough. They invoked Henry VIII's 1543 Act of Treason, demanding the Massachusetts Royal Governor, Francis Bernard, begin arresting these radicals and shipping them back to London to be tried for treason and be hanged. This is one of those ones where the order says, they come to have a fair trial and then we'll hang them. But his Lieutenant Governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who was from New England, was also Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and so he ruled that that was not allowed, and he knew it was not worth his life to enforce odious acts of Parliament or to declare anyone high treason. It was now up to General Gage to try and find a solution, even while he realized that his British regulars were vastly outnumbered in the surrounding colonial militias. He was shocked, however, by the fury of the Boston mobs throwing snowballs and rocks at the British regulars. He was even more shocked when the regulars fired into the crowd, killing several civilians, including Afro-Indigenous seaman Crispus Attucks. This became known as the 1770 Boston Massacre. The British East India Company had been a favorite high-return investment for London's aristocracy, including many serving in Parliament or the King's cabinet. By 1772, over 90% of the company's net profits came from tea. Parliament granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales and employed the British Navy to block foreign and American tea smugglers. It became a question of whose interests Parliament was defending and at what cost to the American colonies. Early in 1773, East India Company shares plunged by nearly half on the London Stock Exchange. It had 17 million tons of unsold tea in warehouses and was unable to pay its bank debts. A dramatic drop in the consumption meant it was facing bankruptcy, and as the year went on, it only got worse. By December 16, 1773, 2 East India cargo ships with tea, about 100,000 pounds of tea worth about $1 million today, the Dartmouth and the Eleanor, were sitting in Boston Harbor. A radical group of tax protesters, some deeply in debt, climbed aboard and destroyed the tea. This threatened to bankrupt the British East India Company, or at least its insurer at Lloyd's of London, or the very English government itself. In May 1774, Parliament declared martial law, shutting down commerce, appointing General Gage as military governor, replacing all officers of the Commonwealth, eliminating jury trials, stripping democracy from the population, severely restricting town meetings, and forcing citizens to quarter or house and feed the British regulars. War now was inevitable. In June 1774, Gage convened the General Court to have them support martial law and then disband. But instead, liberating themselves, they locked the door on him, and then they agreed to meet next in Concord. By August 1774, Concord had become the center of the resistance against the Crown. On August 30th, Concord hosted a convention of 150 delegates representing every town in Middlesex County. Most of the government's newest weapons, as well as weapons remaining from the French and Indian Wars, had been stored in militia warehouses throughout the colony. By the end of September, the armories had been picked clean. With many weapons and supplies stored in Concord, local militias now had more men and more munitions than the British regulars. Without the triangle trade, further acquisition of indigenous land, or an export economy feeding the southern plantations, Concord could not prosper. Under martial law, Concord faced a grim future of increased poverty, stagnation, and depopulation. Concord now needed this revolution to turn its economy around. On September 28, 1774, Concord held an illegal town meeting where they voted to raise 2 companies of militia. One company would consist of so-called Minutemen prepared to fight on a moment's notice, and the other Concord's regular militia. To prepare for war, the town clerk bought 420 pounds of gunpowder, 500 pounds of shot, and a large chest of rifles. Several cannons were then purchased along with 100 pounds of cannonballs. Concord became an armed encampment. In October, Concord hosted 250 delegates from across the state in a first provincial Congress democratically electing John Hancock as its president. It assumed authority to rule the province, collect taxes, buy supplies, and raise a militia. This was a coup d'etat. They forcefully took over the government. The Congress immediately sent Paul Revere to Philadelphia to announce America's first autonomous government. After delegates had received feedback from their respective towns, on November 15, 1774, the Second Provincial Congress, led by John Hancock in Concord, severed all ties with the British Empire. In response, further British reinforcements arrived in Boston on December 19, 1774. I think you know what happened in 1775. If not, you'll hear about it this month. But this was not Longfellow's heroic midnight ride of Paul Revere, much less Emerson's embattled farmers standing by the rude bridge to defend their freedoms. These weren't extraordinary people facing ordinary times, but rather they were ordinary people with all their foibles, greed, fears, courage, and failures, facing extraordinary times. There is much in these stories that we can be proud of, and much that we should be ashamed of. But collectively, these are our ancestors. It helps me to believe that Concord, with all of our foibles, fears, and failings, yet still heard round the world, can once again lead the fight for freedom in extraordinary times like these. May it be so.
Ooh, well, Jim, thank you so much. In view of the time, I think we will dispense with a formal Q&A, but you are all invited to join us next door at the Wright Tavern, where there will be a reception and book sale and book signing, right? You'll be signing books?
And hugs.
I'm sorry?
And hugs.
And hugs. Now, before I let you go, I want to tell you, tomorrow night we are co-sponsoring an event over at the library. This is called Harvesting the Spirit of Transcendentalism in Education Today. So that's at the library at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening in the Goodwin Forum. It is free and open to the public. So Jenny Rankin, Reverend Jenny Rankin, who many of you know was a minister at this church, will be the moderator of a panel. Early childhood educator Betsy Siebert, Finn teacher Elise Mott, and Concord Carlisle High School teacher Tracy Dunn will reflect on how transcendentalism relates to their own teaching practices. So you are all invited. That is co-sponsored by the Transcendentalism Council here and also the Concord Children's Center and Concord 250. So please join us for that tomorrow at the library. And thank you, Jim. We'll see you all over next door at the Wright Tavern.